The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the worn soles of her boots and clung to the threadbare wool of her tunic. Alara knelt on the flagstones, the icy dampness biting into her knees. Her breath plumed in the air of the great hall, little ghosts of warmth swallowed by the cavernous chill. Her hands were raw. The coarse brush scraped against her skin as she scrubbed, the lye soap stinging the cracks in her knuckles. This was her life. Endless stone floors, the sting of soap, and the gnawing ache of hunger in her belly. She was an omega, the lowest of the low in the Blackwood pack, a phantom haunting the edges of pack life. They called her Ash. It was a cruel name, born from the hearth she was always cleaning, but it felt true. She was the leftover soot, the worthless remnant of a fire long extinguished. Her parents, they had whispered, had been traitors, killed for consorting with rogues. Their shame had been branded onto her, an invisible mark that made everyone turn away. She was invisible until someone needed a target. Look at it, wallowing in the filth where it belongs. Lyra's voice, sharp and mocking, sliced through the quiet hall. Alara flinched but did not look up. She kept scrubbing, her focus narrowing to the gray stone, the swirl of dirty water. Maybe if she was small enough, still enough, Lyra would move on. A sharp kick connected with the wooden bucket beside her. Icy, foul water sloshed over the stones and soaked the front of her tunic, a shocking, freezing slap against her skin. The cold was so intense it felt like a burn. Clumsy thing, Lyra sneered. Her two companions tittered, their laughter echoing in the cold air. Lyra was the pack alpha's daughter, beautiful and cruel, with a particular hatred for Alara. Alara squeezed her eyes shut. Don't cry. Don't give her the satisfaction. The mantra was a familiar one, a shield she had built, piece by painful piece, over years of torment. You're making a bigger mess, Ashfoot, Lyra continued, prodding Alara's shoulder with the toe of her fur-lined boot. Now you'll be here all day. I suppose that's fine. It's not like anyone would miss you. The words were stones, each one hitting a bruise she already carried. Worthless, invisible, unwanted. She knew it. She lived it. But hearing it spoken so carelessly still had the power to fracture something inside her. She gritted her teeth, the muscles in her jaw aching. She took a ragged breath, the frigid air searing her lungs, and began to gather her rags to soak up the new, wider mess. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She would not break. She would not shatter. This was her resilience, a quiet, stubborn thing forged in the fires of their contempt. It was a tiny, flickering ember deep within her, a refusal to be completely extinguished. The elders called it a white death, the kind that had not been seen in a century. Snow piled in drifts against the ramparts, and the wind's scream was unending. Fear, thick and cloying, settled over the pack. The fortress, usually a bastion of warmth and strength, felt fragile, a tiny island in a churning sea of white. The log walls groaned. The hunting parties were lost. The firewood stores were dwindling faster than anyone had anticipated. Alpha Valerius grew desperate. His face, normally stern and controlled, was a mask of grim panic. The pack's shamans whispered of ancient rites, of appeasing the old gods of winter who were clearly angered. A sacrifice was needed, they said, a blood price to calm the storm. The whispers found Alara in the kitchens, where she was trying to steal a crust of bread. The words slithered through the panicked crowds. A sacrifice. Something the pack could afford to lose. Something worthless. Her blood ran cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She knew. Before anyone said her name, she knew. Two of the Alpha's enforcers found her huddled by a cold hearth. They were huge men, their faces grim. They did not speak. They did not need to. The pity in their eyes was worse than any hatred. They dragged her from the keep. She didn't fight. What was the point? Her legs felt like water, her mind a numb haze of disbelief and a terrible, inevitable certainty. This was it. This was the end of her miserable existence. They took her to the northern gate, a massive portcullis of iron and oak that was groaning under the assault of the wind. Alpha Valerius stood there, his cloak whipped around him by the gale. Lyra was behind him, a smug, triumphant smirk on her face. "The gods demand a price for our survival," Valerius declared, his voice nearly lost in the storm's roar. He looked at Alara, but his eyes slid past her as if she were already a ghost. "We offer this life, freely given, to appease the great winter." Freely given. The lie was so profound it was almost funny. She was being thrown away like trash, an offering to a storm, and he called it a gift. The enforcers shoved her forward. The gate was winched open just enough for a person to crawl through. A wall of blinding snow and shrieking wind blasted into the tunnel. It was like staring into the throat of a beast. "Go," one of the enforcers grunted, shoving her hard. She stumbled and fell to her knees at the threshold. Beyond it lay nothing but a maelstrom of ice and darkness. Rogue territory. A place where lone wolves were torn apart by feral packs or simply vanished into the unforgiving wilderness. No one survived out there, especially not in a storm like this. She looked back one last time. She saw Lyra's cruel smile, Valerius's cold indifference, and the fearful, averted faces of the pack she had served her whole life. Not one person met her gaze. Not one person spoke for her. A final, brutal shove sent her sprawling out into the snow. The gate slammed shut behind her, the heavy thud of its locking mechanism sealing her fate. The sound was swallowed instantly by the blizzard's fury. She was alone, cast out, a sacrifice. The cold was immediate and absolute. It stole her breath, burned her exposed skin, and blinded her with a swirling vortex of snow. The ember of hope inside her, the one she had guarded so fiercely for so long, was finally, brutally, snuffed out. There was only the wind, the ice, and the certainty of death. She tried to stand, but the wind was a physical force, knocking her down again and again. Disorientation was swift. She had no idea which way she was facing. The fortress was gone, swallowed by the white chaos. Panic, sharp and acidic, clawed at her throat. She had to move. To stop was to die. Forcing herself onto her hands and knees, she began to crawl, letting the slope of the land guide her. Down. She just went down, away from the fortress that had been her prison and was now her executioner. Hours bled into an eternity of freezing misery. The world was a blur of white and gray, the only sound the deafening scream of the wind. The cold was a living thing, sinking its teeth into her flesh, leaching the warmth from her marrow. Her limbs grew heavy, her thoughts sluggish and thick. She was dying. The knowledge was not frightening anymore, just a dull, sad fact. She thought of her parents, faces she could barely remember. Were they waiting for her? Or was there just nothing? Her crawling hands met something that was not snow. Rock, a wall of it rising up into the storm. Hope, a ghost of the feeling, flickered in her chest. She followed the rock face, her frozen fingers scraping against the stone, searching for any kind of shelter. She found it. A dark opening, a narrow fissure in the rock barely wider than her shoulders. A cave. From within, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth seemed to pulse, along with a thick, coppery scent. The smell of blood. Fear warred with desperation. A wounded animal could be inside, a bear, a feral wolf. But the storm was certain death. The cave was only probable death. She chose the cave. She squeezed through the opening and tumbled into the darkness beyond. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, replaced by a heavy, panting silence. The air was warmer here, thick with the scent of blood and something else. Something wild and musky and powerful. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, a shape began to resolve itself in the center of the cavern. It was massive. A wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, its form a study in black fur and coiled muscle. It lay on its side, its breathing shallow and ragged, and it was not alone. The floor of the cave was littered with the bodies of other creatures. They were not wolves. They were things of nightmare, with twisted limbs, too many joints, and skin like hardened shadow. Their empty eye sockets seemed to drink the faint light. The great wolf was bleeding from a dozen deep gashes. A dark, viscous liquid, not quite blood, coated the maws of the dead shadow beasts. He had fought them. He had won. But it had cost him dearly. He was dying. Alara stood frozen, a new kind of fear seizing her. This was no ordinary wolf. This was something ancient and powerful, a spirit of the forest, perhaps, or something more. She took a hesitant step closer. The wolf's head lifted weakly and its eyes met hers. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent, aware, and filled with a universe of pain. And they were the color of molten gold, glowing faintly in the darkness. Her breath caught. She had heard legends of the Alpha King, the supreme ruler of all the shifter clans, whose wolf form was a creature of myth and whose eyes held the fire of the sun. But he was a legend, a figure from stories told around the fire. He could not be real. He could not be here, dying in a forgotten cave. But the agony in those golden eyes was real. The ragged, hitching breaths were real. He was dying, and she was watching it happen. All the fear, all the cold, all the misery of her life seemed to fall away. She was already dead, cast out and left to freeze. Her life was over. But his was not. This magnificent, powerful creature, brought low by things of shadow, deserved to live. She did not know what compelled her. It was an instinct deeper than thought, a pull from the core of her being. She moved forward, her tattered boots silent on the stone floor. She knelt beside the colossal wolf, her own smallness thrown into sharp relief by his sheer size. He watched her, a low growl rumbling in his chest, a sound of warning and profound weakness. He was too injured to move, to defend himself. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was a ridiculous thing to say to a creature that could likely swallow her whole. She reached out a trembling hand, the one that was not scraped raw from scrubbing. Her fingers were numb with cold, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace of life that was rapidly cooling. She wanted to offer comfort. It was the only thing she had ever wanted to give, and the one thing no one had ever wanted from her. She hesitated for a second, her fingers hovering over a deep, bleeding gash on his shoulder. Then, with a quiet resolve, she pressed her palm against his thick, blood-matted fur. The world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A cataclysm of pure energy erupted from the point of contact. A searing, blinding heat shot up her arm, straight into her heart. It was a pain beyond any she had ever known. A fire that felt like it was unmaking her, atom by atom. She screamed, or tried to. The sound was stolen from her lungs. She was falling into a star, a supernova of sensation. White light bleached the darkness from her vision. On the back of her hand, an agony so sharp and specific it was a relief from the whole body immolation, focused itself. It felt like a brand was being burned directly into her flesh and bone. Through the blinding light, she saw the wolf's golden eyes widen, the pain in them momentarily replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock. A new voice, not hers, not spoken but felt deep within her soul, echoed through the chaos. It was a single, possessive, undeniable word. Mine. The force of it threw her backward. She hit the cave wall hard, her head cracking against the stone. The white light receded, leaving shimmering spots in her vision. The pain in her arm subsided to a throbbing, burning ache. The wounds on his body were closing. Even as she watched, the deep gash on his shoulder sealed itself, leaving behind fresh pink skin. The bond, the contact, it was healing him. He took a step toward her. She flinched, pressing herself harder against the cold stone wall. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. This was impossible. Magic. A monster. A man. The Alpha King. "You," he said, and his voice was deep, a rumble that vibrated in her bones. It was not a question. It was a statement, a recognition. Her body was screaming at her to run, to flee, to get away from this impossible creature. But another part of her, a deep, primal instinct she never knew she possessed, was utterly still. It recognized him. It felt the hum of connection, the strange, terrifying rightness of his presence. The mark on her hand pulsed with warmth, a beacon answering the call of his gaze. What are you?" she stammered, the words barely a whisper. He took another step, his golden eyes never leaving hers. They drank her in, a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "I am Kaelin," he said, his voice softer now but no less absolute. "And you are mine." The possessiveness in that statement should have terrified her. It did terrify her, but beneath the fear, a strange, treacherous warmth bloomed in her chest. To be claimed, to be wanted. After a lifetime of being nothing, the idea of being his was a terrifying, seductive poison. He stopped a few feet from her, seeming to sense her fear. He did not push, did not press his advantage. He simply stood there, a being of immense power, letting her see him. He was wounded, yes, but even in this state, his presence filled the cave, dwarfing everything in it. "Your hand," he said, his gaze dropping to the glowing mark. Alara instinctively tried to hide it, pulling it close to her chest. The light of the sigil shone through the thin fabric of her tunic. "It is the soul bond," he explained, his voice low and patient, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "It is not manifested in our people for 1,000 years. It signifies a true mate, a perfect match of souls." He looked back up at her face, his expression unreadable, a mix of awe and something that looked like profound relief. "I have been waiting for you." Waiting for her? A worthless Omega? An outcast named Ash? It made no sense. This had to be a mistake, a fever dream brought on by the cold. She was nobody. He was a king. I don't understand," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm no one." "You are her," he said, as if that explained everything, as if her identity was not defined by her past, but by her connection to him. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the shock, the cold, the magical backlash. It was all too much. The edges of her vision began to darken. He must have seen it in her face. In 2 swift, silent strides, he was before her. He knelt, bringing his face level with hers. The sheer heat coming off his body was a shock, a welcome furnace against her frozen skin. "I have you," he murmured, his voice a low thrum of reassurance. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pull the ragged fur blanket from the shoulders of one of his fallen warriors and drape it around her. The fur was thick and warm, smelling of pine and leather and him. She sagged into the warmth, her trembling starting to subside. His proximity was overwhelming. Her every instinct screamed with a conflict she couldn't comprehend. Her mind, conditioned by a lifetime of abuse, saw a predator, a threat. But her soul, newly awakened and branded, felt home. It was the most confusing, terrifying sensation of her life. Before either of them could say another word, the sound of voices echoed from the mouth of the cave. "Alpha Kaelin! Your Majesty!" Kaelin's head snapped up, his posture instantly shifting from one of cautious tenderness to that of a king. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "In here!" he called out, his voice booming with authority. Seconds later, several large men in silver-inlaid leather armor pushed their way into the cavern. They were his patrol, his guards. They froze at the sight before them. The cave littered with the bodies of shadowhounds, their king naked and wounded, and a small, ragged female huddled against the wall. "Your Majesty," the leader breathed, his eyes wide with shock and relief. "We tracked the hounds. We feared the worst." His gaze flickered to Alara, dismissive and wary, and Omega, astray. "The situation is handled, Riker," Kalen said, his voice clipped. He rose to his full, intimidating height, shielding Alara from their view with his body. "Bring my effects, and bring a healer." Riker nodded, still staring. Then he saw it. The soft, silvery glow from behind his king. He saw the branded hand Alara was clutching to her chest. His jaw went slack. His eyes, and the eyes of every other warrior in the cave, widened in stunned disbelief. None of them spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken shock. They had not just found their king alive. They had found the impossible. They had found his mate. The news would travel like wildfire. The long, lonely Alpha King, the most powerful shifter on the continent, had found his soul-bonded mate. And she was a terrified, ragged Omega hiding in a cave. Back in the Blackwood Pack's fortress, the blizzard had abated. Alpha Valerius claimed the storm's end as a sign that his sacrifice had been accepted. The Pack, relieved and eager to believe, celebrated their deliverance. No one spoke Alara's name. She was forgotten, a necessary price. But Lyra did not forget. Her triumph soured quickly into a restless, bitter jealousy. It was not enough that Alara was gone. She wanted to know she had suffered. She wanted details. She sent a trusted scout, a sycophant named Jax, to follow Alara's path as soon as the storm cleared, to bring back proof of her demise. Jax returned days later, his face pale with a mixture of fear and awe. He found Lyra in her chambers. "She's alive," he whispered, his voice trembling. Lyra's eyes narrowed. "What? That's impossible. No one could have survived that storm." "She's with him," Jax breathed, his voice barely audible. "The Alpha King. His patrol found her. They say she bears his mark. The soul bond." The word struck Lyra like a physical blow. The king? The legendary, untouchable Alpha King Kalen, bonded to Ash? The worthless, filthy Omega she had tormented her entire life? It was a cosmic joke. A horrifying, unbearable insult. Rage, black and venomous, flooded her. All her life, she had preened and postured, dreaming of catching the eye of a powerful Alpha from the king's court. She was the Alpha's daughter. She was beautiful. She was worthy. And yet, destiny had chosen the girl who scrubbed her floors. "No," Lyra hissed, her hands clenching into fists. "No, I won't allow it." That night, a dark thought took root in the fertile ground of her hatred. The Alpha King had enemies, powerful ones. Whisper spoke of a shadowy faction, a cult that called themselves the Ember Covenant, led by a mysterious figure who sought to usurp Kalen's throne. Lyra had heard rumors of their influence, of their spies hidden in packs across the territories. She knew a man in her own pack, a bitter, older warrior who had been passed over for promotion, who sometimes spoke of a truer power than the king's. She found him in the training yards. She told him what Jax had seen. She told him the king's prophesied mate had been found, and that she was a weak, powerless Omega with no training, no family, and no allies. A weak link. A vulnerability no one had known the king possessed. The man's eyes lit with a dark fire. He saw the opportunity immediately. This information was a key that could unlock a kingdom. Within the hour, a coded message was sent by Raven, flying not towards the king's capital, but towards the jagged, volcanic peaks of the Shadow Fang Mountains. The message was simple. The Sun Queen has been found. She is unguarded. Alara knew nothing of this. Her world had become a whirlwind of overwhelming sensation. Kaelin had bundled her in furs and carried her from the cave as if she weighed nothing. They had journeyed for a day, his elite guard forming a silent, protective phalanx around them. They arrived at a fortress carved into the heart of a mountain. It was vast and beautiful. A city of stone and light, filled with warmth and the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. It was nothing like the damp, grim fortress of the Blackwood Pack. She was taken to a suite of rooms that was larger than the entire great hall she used to clean. A fire blazed in a marble hearth. Gowns of silk and velvet were laid out on a bed piled high with furs. Servants, quiet and respectful, brought her food, hot stew and fresh bread and sweet wine. They called her Luna, their voices filled with a reverence that made her skin crawl. She was terrified. None of it felt real. She felt like an imposter, a grimy girl playing dress-up, and at any moment someone would rip the fine clothes away and throw her back into the cold. Kaelin was a constant, overwhelming presence. He did not leave her side for long. He would sit in a chair by the fire while she ate, his golden eyes watching her with a possessive intensity that made it hard to breathe. He spoke little, but his presence was a declaration. You are here. You are with me. You are safe. But she did not feel safe. She felt like a captured bird in a golden cage. The bond thrummed between them, a constant, low-level vibration in her soul. It pulled her toward him, a strange and powerful tide. She could feel his emotions as faint echoes in her own mind. His relief, his fierce protectiveness, a deep, ancient loneliness that was now beginning to ease. It was too much, too fast. From outcast to queen in the span of 2 days. Her mind could not reconcile it. The self-doubt, the ingrained feeling of worthlessness, was a poison that tainted everything. She did not deserve this. She was not this person, this Luna. She was Ash, the girl who was not even worthy of life. One evening, she stood on the balcony of her chambers, looking out at the snow-covered peaks gleaming under a sky full of stars. Kaelin came to stand beside her. He had not touched her again since that first, cataclysmic moment in the cave. He seemed to understand her fear, her fragility. You are trembling, he said, his voice a low murmur. I'm cold, she lied. He did not call her on the lie. He simply moved to stand slightly in front of her, blocking the chilly wind with his large frame. The heat from his body washed over her and, despite herself, she leaned slightly closer to it. This is your home now, Alara, he said softly. He had asked for her name, and when she'd whispered it, he had forbidden anyone from ever calling her Ash again. You have nothing to fear. I am afraid of everything, she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. I don't belong here. I'm not what you think I am. He turned then, his golden eyes searching hers in the starlight. I know exactly what you are, he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. You are the other half of my soul. Before she could process the weight of his words, a sudden commotion erupted from the corridor outside her rooms. Shouts, the clash of steel. Kaelin stiffened, a savage growl tearing from his throat. He pushed her behind him, his body becoming a solid wall of muscle. Stay here, he commanded, his eyes flashing with dangerous light as he drew a wicked-looking blade from a sheath she hadn't even noticed at his belt. The doors to her chambers burst inward, splintering off their hinges. Figures clad in black leather, their faces hidden by shadow-woven masks, poured into the room. They moved with a silent, unnatural swiftness. Assassins. Kaelin met them with a roar, a whirlwind of silver and fury. He was magnificent and terrifying, a king defending his territory. But they were not trying to fight him. They were a distraction. While he was engaged with the three at the door, two more materialized from the shadows on the balcony. They had come from over the edge. Before Alara could even scream, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, and a sharp, stinging pain pricked her neck. Her muscles went limp. The world tilted, the stars blurring into streaks of light. The last thing she saw was Kaelin's head snapping around, his face a mask of pure, primal fury as he saw her fall. His roar of her name was the last thing she heard before darkness swallowed her whole. She awoke to pain. A dull, throbbing ache pulsed from the brand on her hand, a sickly, weak beat instead of its usual warm thrum. She was lying on a cold stone floor, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and decay. She sat up, her head spinning. She was in a circular chamber, lit by eerie, green-glowing crystals embedded in the walls. Chains were clasped around her wrists, their cold weight terrifyingly familiar. But these were different. They were made of silver, and where the metal touched her skin, it burned. A low, constant agony. The silver was dampening the bond. She could feel it. The connection to Kaelin, which had been a constant, humming presence, was now a faint, distant thread. It felt like a part of her had been amputated. The separation was a physical anguish, a hollow ache in the center of her chest. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. "Awake, I see." The voice was smooth, cultured, yet carried an undercurrent of chilling malice. A figure stepped out of the shadows. He was tall and slender, dressed in robes of black and crimson. His face was unnervingly handsome, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of cold ash. There was no warmth in him, only a chilling, predatory intelligence. "Where am I?" Alara asked, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" "You are in the heart of my domain," he said with a small, cruel smile. "The citadel of Umbra. And I am Lord Malachor." The name sent a shiver of pure dread down her spine. The Shadow King. The leader of the Ember Covenant. Kaelin's mortal enemy. "What do you want with me?" she whispered, tugging uselessly at the silver chains. The burning intensified. Malachor circled her slowly, like a wolf studying its prey. "For centuries, Kaelin has been untouchable, invincible, his power absolute. I have long sought a weakness, a crack in his armor. And then, my dear, you appeared." He stopped in front of her and crouched down, his cold eyes boring into hers. A soul bond, a legend, a connection that ties the Alpha King's very life force to another, a connection that flows both ways. He draws strength from you, but you are his anchor, and anchors can be broken. His plan slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. He was going to use her to destroy Kaelin. The despair she felt moments ago curdled into a new, fierce emotion. Terror, not for herself, but for him. "You won't succeed," she spat, finding a sliver of defiance. "He will find me." Malachor laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Oh, I have no doubt he will try. But by the time he arrives, it will be too late. The ritual will be complete. Ritual? A severing, he explained, his eyes gleaming with fanatic light. My covenant has rediscovered the ancient rites. We will use your bond as a conduit, a siphon. We will not just break the connection, we will drain his power through it, leaving him a hollow, broken shell. And then I will take his throne. He stood and turned away, his robes sweeping the floor. And you, my dear Luna, are the key to it all, the little Omega who will bring down a king. He left her then, alone in the greenlit darkness, the burning of the silver chains a constant reminder of her helplessness. The weakened bond was a torment. She could feel Kaelin, a distant storm of unimaginable rage and panic and pain, a mirror of her own. He was feeling her absence, her fear. The thought of his suffering was worse than any physical pain Malachor could inflict. She closed her eyes, focusing all her will on that thin, fragile thread connecting them. She had to reach him. She had to tell him. She poured all her fear, her desperation, and a burgeoning, fierce love she was only just now admitting to herself into that connection. Kaelin. Her mind screamed his name into the void. For a long moment, there was nothing. Only the cold, the pain, and the crushing despair. She was about to give up, to sink into the hopelessness, when she felt it. A flicker. A faint pulse of warmth against the cold. A thread of gold in the oppressive darkness. And then, his voice. Not a sound, but a raw, powerful thought, blazing across the distance, right into the core of her soul. Ilara. Her name was a vow, a promise of bloody retribution. Hold on, I am coming. Tears of relief and terror streamed down her face. He was coming. But Malachor was right. Would he be too late? Time lost all meaning in the cell. The only markers were the changing of guards and the moments they brought her stale bread and water. Her hope, bolstered by Kaelin's promise, began to fray with every passing hour. The silver chains were doing their work, sapping her strength, making the world feel gray and distant. Finally, they came for her. 2 of Malachor's robed acolytes unfastened her from the wall and dragged her from the cell. Her legs were weak, and she stumbled, her body aching from the cold and the constant burn of the silver. They led her into a vast circular chamber. A ritual circle, etched in glowing crimson runes, dominated the floor. In the center was a stone altar. Lord Malachor stood beside it, holding a jagged obsidian knife. His eyes were alight with a feverish, triumphant glow. The celestial alignment is perfect, he announced to the assembled acolytes who lined the chamber walls. The bond is at its most vulnerable. Tonight, we drain the false king and welcome an era of shadow. The acolytes began to chant, a low, guttural drone that vibrated through the stone and into Ilara's bones. The air grew thick, heavy with dark energy. The crimson runes on the floor pulsed with malevolent light. They forced her onto the cold stone altar, chaining her wrists and ankles to iron rings. She lay there, exposed and helpless, staring up at the vaulted, cavernous ceiling. This was it. The end. She had been a sacrifice for her old pack, and now she was to be a sacrifice for Kaelin's enemies. Her life was just a tool to be used and discarded by powerful men. Malachor raised the obsidian knife. "Let us begin," he hissed. He made the first cut, not on her, but in the air above her, slicing through some unseen barrier. The bond, already weakened, screamed in her soul. A wave of agony, sharp and blinding, ripped through her. She cried out, arching her back against the stone. Through the bond, she felt a corresponding shockwave of pain hit Kaelin, wherever he was. He was close. He was so close. Malachor smiled, seeing the pain on her face. Yes, he whispered. He feels it. He is connected. Now, to open the conduit. He lowered the tip of the obsidian blade toward the glowing sunburst mark on her hand. At that exact moment, the entire citadel shook. Boom! An explosion so powerful it cracked the very foundations of the chamber, blew the northern wall to dust and rubble. A wave of frigid night air and snow blasted into the ritual chamber, extinguishing half the glowing crystals and sending acolytes tumbling. Through the dust and swirling snow, a figure emerged. Kaelin. He was no longer a king. He was a god of vengeance. His golden eyes were blazing infernos of pure rage. But Malachor was cunning, using dark magic to parry and feint, his movements serpentine and unpredictable. Elara, forgotten on the altar, could only watch in terror. She pulled against her chains, the silver burning her raw, but she had to get free. She had to help him. The fight was brutal. Kaelin pressed his advantage, driving Malachor back step by step. But the Shadow King was desperate. He summoned tendrils of pure shadow from the floor, lashing out like whips. Kaelin dodged and weaved, cutting them apart, but it gave Malachor an opening. While Kaelin was occupied with a writhing mass of shadow, Malachor lunged. Not with the obsidian knife, but with a blade of pure, solidified darkness he formed in his other hand. He drove it deep into Kaelin's shoulder. Kaelin roared in pain, a sound of shock and fury. The dark magic of the blade sizzled against his flesh. He staggered, falling to one knee, his golden eyes dimming for a fraction of a second. Seeing him fall, seeing the man who had called her mine, the man who had crossed a continent to save her, brought to his knees by that shadowy filth, something inside Elara did not break. It detonated. The ingrained worthlessness, the years of abuse, the fear, the despair. It all burned away in an instant, consumed by a volcanic eruption of pure, protective rage. The tiny ember she had guarded for so long roared into a sun. A wave of incandescent, pure white light exploded from her body. It was not hot. It was not cold. It was simply light. A cleansing, absolute force. It vaporized the shadow tendrils instantly. It slammed into the acolytes, not burning them, but scouring the dark magic from them, leaving them screaming and clutching their heads as their power was ripped away. The crimson runes on the floor dissolved into nothing. The silver chains on Alara's wrists and ankles did not just break. They melted, turning into streams of harmless, molten metal that dripped to the floor. She sat up, and the light coalesced, sinking back into her until she herself seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. The sunburst mark on her hand was no longer a soft glow. It was a blazing silver star. Malachor stared at her, his face a mask of complete shock and disbelief. The dark blade in Kaylin's shoulder evaporated as the light washed over it. What are you?" he snarled, taking an involuntary step back. Alara slid off the altar. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. All that remained was a cold, crystalline fury and a love for the man on his knee so fierce it was a weapon. She looked at Kaylin, who was staring at her with wide, awestruck golden eyes. Then she turned her gaze to Malachor. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It rang with an impossible power, an authority she had never known she possessed. "I am his," she said, the words a simple, undeniable truth. "And you will not touch him." She raised her hand, the one with the blazing mark. The light gathered around her fingers, coalescing, hardening. It formed into a spear of solid, shimmering light, humming with power. With a cry that was part rage, part declaration, she lunged forward. She moved with a speed and grace she did not know she had, a warrior born in a flash of divine fire. Malachor, his dark magic useless against her pure light, had only a moment to register his doom before she drove the spear of light directly through his chest. There was no blood, only a final, silent scream as the light consumed him from within, turning him to a cascade of black ash that scattered on the cold stone floor. Silence fell over the chamber. The battle was over. The remaining acolytes, their power broken, had surrendered or fled. All that was left was the dust, the rubble, and the two of them in the center of the ruined circle. Alara stood, panting, the spear of light dissolving from her hand. The glow around her softened, receding until it was just the bright, steady pulse of the mark on her skin. The power, the rage, drained away, leaving her trembling, her legs threatening to give out. Kaylin was on his feet. He rushed to her, his face a maelstrom of emotions, awe, relief, concern, and a love so profound it stole her breath. He didn't hesitate. He gathered her into his arms, crushing her against his chest in an embrace that was both fierce and exquisitely gentle. She buried her face in his shoulder, inhaling his scent, pine and winter storms and him. Safe. For the first time in her life, she felt completely and utterly safe. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on, her body shaking with the aftermath of it all. "You saved me," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled back just enough to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His golden eyes searched hers, filled with a worshipful reverence. "I told you I was coming," she whispered back, a faint, watery smile touching her lips. It was a weak echo of his own promise, but he understood. He looked down at her hand, at the blazing sunburst mark. He gently took her hand in his large, calloused fingers wrapping around hers. He traced the lines of the sigil with his thumb, a touch that sent a shiver of pure pleasure through her. "My queen," he breathed. As his thumb passed over the center of the mark, it flared with a brilliant silver-white light. A jolt of energy, warm and powerful, shot up her arm and straight into her heart. But this time, it didn't hurt. It felt like completion, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Kalen gasped, his hand flying to his own chest over his heart. Alara looked, and through the tear in his tunic she saw a new mark burning itself into existence on his skin. It was a mirror of hers, a sunburst etched in lines of shadow and gold, a dark sun against his flesh. The bond was now a circle, complete and unbreakable. He was hers, just as she was his. A wave of her power, the gentle, life-giving light, flowed from her through their joined hands. It poured into him, and she watched as the last traces of the wound on his shoulder vanished, the skin knitting together, leaving no scar. She had healed him. He looked from the new mark on his chest to her face, his expression one of utter devotion. He lowered his head and finally, captured her lips with his. The kiss was not one of desperate relief, but of deep, soul-shattering certainty. It was a seal, a vow, a homecoming. It tasted of forever. Days later, they stood on the grand balcony of the Citadel of the Dawn, Kalen's mountain fortress. The sun was bright on the snow, and a vast crowd of his people had gathered in the square below. Shifters of every kind, wolves, bears, eagles, serpents, all stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces turned upward. Alara stood beside him. She was no longer in rags, but in a gown of silver so fine it seemed woven for moonlight. She was not the same girl who had been cast out into the storm. That girl was gone, burned away in a blaze of light and love. Kalen took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He raised their joined hands for the entire city to see, displaying the glowing mark on her skin. His voice, amplified by the mountain air, boomed across the square, a king's proclamation. "Behold, Alara of the Light, my soul-bonded mate," he declared, his voice ringing with pride and power. "Behold, your queen!" A moment of stunned silence, and then the crowd erupted. A single, unified roar of acclamation shook the mountains. It was a sound of joy, of acceptance, of loyalty. They were not cheering for a king's consort. They were cheering for the woman who had faced down the shadow and won, the queen who shone with her own light. Alara looked out at the sea of faces, at the thousands of people who now looked to her not with contempt or pity, but with reverence. She looked at the magnificent, powerful man standing beside her, the man whose soul was now intertwined with hers. She felt the steady, warm pulse of the bond, a constant reassurance of his love, his presence. The deep, aching loneliness she had carried in her bones her entire life, the gnawing certainty of her own worthlessness, finally, completely dissolved. It was replaced by a profound sense of peace and belonging. She was not Ash. She was not an outcast. She was not a sacrifice. She was Alara. She was a healer. She was a warrior. She was loved. She was queen. And she was, at long last, home.